This content is presented for educational, historical, and cultural analysis purposes. All theological interpretations shared here reflect the views of various scholars and traditions, and should be understood as according to the interpretation of unredacted rather than absolute doctrinal claims. Viewers are encouraged to study, verify, and form their own understanding through personal research and spiritual guidance.
Imagine standing in a courtroom, not with a judge, not with a jury, but with an entire crowd demanding you either compromise your convictions or face death. No lawyer, no appeals process, no witness in your corner. That was the reality for a man named Eleazar, whose story is recorded in what historians and scholars refer to as the Deuterocanonical or Second Temple Jewish literature, specifically in the Second Book of Maccabees, a text that, according to most historical and religious scholarship, dates roughly to the 2nd century BCE. And what makes his story remarkable isn't just that he was accused, it's how he responded, and what that response reveals about identity, integrity, and what ancient communities believed about divine justice. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll see why his story has resonated across more than 2,000 years of human history, and why it still speaks directly to people today who feel misrepresented, misunderstood, or falsely pressured. Setting the historical context, before we dive into Eleazar himself, we need to understand the world he lived in, because without that context, his story loses half its power. We're talking about roughly since 67 BCE, the Seleucid Empire under a king named Antiochus IV, who gave himself the title Epiphans, meaning God manifest, had taken control of Judea. Now, according to historians like Elias Bickerman and more recently scholars such as John Marr, Antiochus's cultural policies were aggressive. He appears to have pushed what we might call a Hellenization campaign, an effort to unify his empire under Greek culture, language, and religious practice. For many Jews living in Judea at the time, this created an existential crisis. Their ancestral laws, their dietary practices, their religious calendar, all of it was, according to the historical sources we have, under significant pressure. The first and second books of Maccabees describe what is possibly one of the most intense periods of religious and cultural suppression in ancient Jewish history, and scholars debate the exact nature and extent of that suppression. Some argue it was more politically motivated than religiously systematic, but what most agree on is this: people were being forced to make choices, publicly comply or resist, and Eleazar chose resistance. Who was Eleazar? According to 2nd Maccabees chapter 6, Eleazar was described as a scribe, a man of learning, and as someone already elderly, likely in his 90s according to the text, though some scholars note that ancient texts sometimes used age as a literary device to emphasize wisdom and dignity rather than as a precise biographical detail. What we do know based on the text itself is that Eleazar held a position of community respect. He wasn't an anonymous figure, he was known. And that's precisely why what happened to him mattered so much to those watching. He was brought forward and commanded to eat pork, a practice explicitly prohibited under the dietary laws found in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, texts that formed the backbone of Jewish legal identity. Now here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part of the story that feels almost shockingly modern. The authorities didn't just demand he eat it. According to the text, men who had known Eleazar, possibly associates or acquaintances trying to help him, pulled him aside and offered him an escape route, a way out that looked like compliance without actually being compliance. The offer, as described in 2nd Maccabees, was essentially this: bring your own meat, pretend to eat what we've given you, and walk away alive. In other words, perform the betrayal without technically committing it. Eleazar refused. The psychology of the false performance. And this is where his story transcends ancient history and enters something universal. Because what Eleazar identified, what he articulated with remarkable clarity for a man facing death, was the danger of performing a false identity for the sake of survival. His reasoning, as recorded, wasn't simply religious. It was deeply social and psychological. He said, according to the text, and I'm paraphrasing here rather than quoting directly, that if he went through with the deception, younger members of the community would see him and believe that Eleazar at the age of 90 had abandoned his convictions under pressure, that the performance of the lie would become functionally the lie itself. He was thinking not just about himself, but about the narrative that would be constructed around his actions by others. This is something that modern researchers in social psychology would recognize immediately. We know that public behavior shapes community norms. We know that visible capitulation by respected figures often creates permission structures for others to follow. Eleazar appears to have understood this intuitively. He chose death over a story that wasn't true about him, False accusations through a historical lens now, to be precise. The situation Eleazar faced wasn't exactly a false accusation in the courtroom sense. He wasn't being accused of a crime he didn't commit. He was being pressured to perform an act that contradicted his identity. But there's a category of false accusation deeply embedded in this story that we shouldn't miss. By accepting the compromise, by eating the meat or pretending to, he would have allowed a false narrative about himself to circulate as truth, that he had given up, that he had agreed, that he no longer held the convictions he had built his entire life around. In that sense, the false accusation wasn't verbal, it was behavioral. It was the accusation that this is who you really are when it matters. And scholars studying the Maccabean literature, people like Daniel Schwartz and Robert Doran, have noted that the martyrdom accounts in 2nd Maccabees are particularly focused on witness. The Greek word martyrs, from which we get martyr, simply meant witness, someone who testified through their actions, not just their words. Eleazar was refusing to give false witness about himself. What the text says about divine justice. Now here's where we need to be careful and honest about what the text does and doesn't say. 2nd Maccabees does present Eleazar's death in the framework of what the author understood as divine providence, the idea that suffering endured with integrity serves a larger purpose in God's economy of justice. But it would be historically irresponsible to claim this as a simple formula: suffer faithfully and God will rescue you in this life. The text doesn't say that. Eleazar dies. He is not rescued in a dramatic last-minute intervention. What the text offers, and what scholars of Second Temple Jewish theology consistently note, is a framework of posthumous vindication. The idea, which appears more clearly in texts like the Wisdom of Solomon, and later in apocalyptic Jewish literature, is that divine justice operates on a timeline that doesn't always correspond to human experience within a single lifetime. This was actually a relatively new theological development in Second Temple Judaism. Scholars like George Nicholsburg have written extensively about how the period between roughly the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE saw significant development in Jewish thought around resurrection, afterlife, and the justice of God as extending beyond physical death. So the justice of God that Eleazar was appealing to was not primarily rescue from the situation. It was integrity in the face of the situation, grounded in a belief that the story didn't end with his death. Parental storings. The 7 brothers Eleazar's story in 2nd Maccabees is immediately followed by one of the most striking narratives in all of ancient literature, the account of 7 brothers and their mother who face similar pressure and make similar choices. This sequence is clearly literary and theological in structure. Scholars debate whether these are straightforward historical accounts, theological narratives designed to inspire, or some combination of both, a genre sometimes called didactic history or edifying narrative, common in the ancient Near East. What's notable is that the brothers, particularly in chapters 7, articulate a sophisticated theology of resurrection. They express confidence not just that their cause is just, but that their physical bodies will be restored, a concept that was contested even within Judaism of the period, as we know from the Gospels, where the Sadducees rejected resurrection while the Pharisees embraced it. This places the Maccabean martyrdom accounts at a fascinating intersection of religious development, moments where ideas about divine justice were being articulated under the pressure of lived experience, theology, in other words, being formed in crisis. False accusations in ancient law and culture. Let's step back and look at false accusation in the broader ancient world, because it gives us important context for understanding why stories like Eleazar's resonated so deeply in ancient legal systems across the Near East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later in Roman law. False accusation was taken seriously as a legal and moral problem. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to roughly 1750 BCE, included provisions for what happened if an accuser could not prove their charge. In some cases, the accuser faced the same penalty they had sought. For the accused. In the Hebrew Bible itself, Deuteronomy chapter 19 outlines what scholars call the lex talionis principle applied to false witnesses. The false witness bears the punishment intended for the falsely accused. This wasn't merely punitive. It reflected an understanding that false accusation was an attack on the social fabric itself, on the reliability of testimony, on the trustworthiness of community life. And in the Roman period, which overlaps with the later Maccabean era and the world of the New Testament, false accusations were a recognized political tool. Calumnia, the Latin term for malicious prosecution, was actually a crime under Roman law, though enforcement was inconsistent and heavily dependent on social status. What this tells us is that the experience Eleazar navigated, being pressured to perform a false identity under the threat of consequences, was not unique to his moment. It was a recurring feature of human social and political life. The modern resonance. Why this story enders? So why does a story from a text written over 2,000 years ago still find readers, still generate sermons, academic papers, and now apparently YouTube videos? There are several reasons, and I think they're worth naming directly. First, the experience of being pressured to misrepresent yourself is universal. Whether it's professional, social, familial, or political, most people have at some point faced a version of Eleazar's dilemma. Just go along with it. No one will know. It's easier this way. Second, the question of what constitutes real justice, especially when human systems fail, is perennial. Ancient communities developed theological frameworks to answer it. Those frameworks continue to provide meaning for billions of people today, and they deserve to be engaged seriously rather than dismissed. Third, the martyrdom literature of the Maccabean period had outsized influence on later traditions. According to many scholars, including Jan Willem van Henten, these texts influenced early Christian understandings of martyrdom, the theology of suffering, and ideas about resurrection. You cannot fully understand early Christianity without understanding 2nd Maccabees. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, Eleazar models something that is genuinely rare: the courage to maintain an honest account of yourself, even when a false one would be more convenient. A note on interpretation and denominational diversity. Before we continue, it's worth noting that 2nd Maccabees is not part of the Hebrew Bible canon as recognized in Judaism or Protestant Christianity. It is, however, part of the Deuteronomy recognized by Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions. This means that depending on your background, Eleazar's story may be familiar or relatively unknown. Jewish tradition does preserve memory of the Maccabean period, most visibly through Hanukkah, which commemorates events described in 1st Maccabees. But the martyrdom accounts are more prominent in Catholic and Orthodox liturgical and devotional tradition. This is not a reason to dismiss the text's historical and literary value. Scholars across traditions, and including secular historians, have found it a significant source for understanding the Second Temple period. What this denominational diversity also means is that different communities have interpreted the story's implications for divine justice somewhat differently. A fact worth acknowledging rather than papering over. What God's justice meant in different layers of the text. Let's dig into the theology a little more carefully because I think it's more nuanced than it sometimes gets presented. The author of 2nd Maccabees, whose identity is unknown, though the text claims to be an abridgment of a larger work by someone named Jason of Cyrene, presents suffering within a specific theological framework. In chapter 6, the author actually pauses the narrative to offer an editorial comment. He suggests that the suffering of the Jewish community under Antiochus was not evidence that God had abandoned them, but rather that God was disciplining them, a parent correcting a child rather than an enemy destroying an opponent. Scholars have noted this reflects what is sometimes called covenantal theology, the understanding prevalent in texts like Deuteronomy and the prophetic literature, that national suffering could be interpreted as consequence and correction rather than abandonment. This is a theologically specific claim, one that other texts in the Jewish canon handle differently. The Book of Job, for example, explicitly resists the simple equation of suffering and divine punishment. What this tells us is that even within ancient Jewish theology, there was robust debate about why the righteous suffer and what divine justice actually looks like in practice. Eleazar's story doesn't resolve that debate, it lives inside it. Eleazar, a model of digmat resistance. One of the most striking features of Eleazar's account, and one that historians of religion frequently highlight, is the dignity with which he faces his situation. He doesn't rage, he doesn't collapse, he doesn't perform heroics, he reasons, he explains calmly and in some detail why he is making the choice he is making. He names the community impact, he names his concern for younger people watching, he names what he believes about the life ahead of him. This is, according to scholars like Robin Darling-Young, who has written on early martyrdom literature, a very particular literary construction of the ideal death, what the Greeks called eulogos, teleut, a reasonable or rational ending. The Hellenistic cultural context, the very culture that was oppressing him, had a strong tradition of the philosopher martyr, the person who faces death with philosophical composure, Socrates being the most famous example. The author of 2nd Maccabees appears to be using that cultural framework while also subverting it. Eleazar dies not in service of abstract philosophy, but of specific ancestral covenant. It's a fascinating literary move that reflects the cultural crosscurrents of the Hellenistic Jewish world. Practical reflections, navigating false narratives today. Now I want to be clear, I'm not in a position to tell you exactly what God is doing in your specific circumstances. No one is. And anyone who claims that kind of certainty deserves healthy skepticism. But there are some principles from Eleazar's story that translate across contexts, and I think they're worth sitting with. First, identity clarity matters before crisis hits. Eleazar knew what he believed and why before the moment of pressure arrived. He wasn't figuring it out under duress. That's significant. Most people who collapse under social or professional pressure do so not because they lack courage, but because they lack clarity. They haven't decided what they actually stand for, so they're vulnerable to whatever the moment demands. Second, the performance of a false identity has real costs, not just for you, but for those watching. This is the insight that strikes me as most contemporary. We live in an era of carefully managed public images, strategic ambiguity, and performed beliefs. Eleazar's warning that living a public lie shapes those who witness it is, if anything, more relevant in a media-saturated environment than it was in the 2nd century BCE. Third, justice operating on a timeline you don't control is a deeply uncomfortable but possibly accurate description of reality. Ancient communities developed theological frameworks to cope with this. Whether or not you share those frameworks, the underlying observation that not every injustice is resolved within the time frame we'd prefer is empirically true. The question of what to do with that reality is one of the deepest questions a human being can face. Fourth, dignity in the face of pressure is itself a form of testimony. What Eleazar demonstrated, what the text explicitly says he wanted to demonstrate, was that his convictions were real, not performances, not social conventions, real. And the way you prove that a conviction is real is precisely by holding it when holding it costs you something. The Broader Maccabean legacy. It's worth zooming out one more time to appreciate the historical legacy of this period. The Maccabean revolt, which this martyrdom tradition is connected to, represents, according to many historians, one of history's earlier instances of what we might now call resistance to cultural assimilation by force. It's studied in both Jewish history and in broader histories of religious freedom. The outcome of the revolt, the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem, commemorated by Hanukkah, represents, at least in the narrative framework of the Maccabean books, a form of the divine justice that figures like Eleazar had appealed to, not in their individual lifetimes necessarily, but in the life of the community they were part of. Whether this constitutes divine intervention or the complex outcome of political and military events is a question that, depending on your framework, may have very different answers. What's not in dispute is that the Maccabean period was a turning point, historically, theologically, and culturally, for Second Temple Judaism, and the stories it generated, including Eleazar's, shaped religious imagination for millennia afterward. Voices from history. How later trad this story? Early Christian writers were deeply familiar with the Maccabean martyrdom accounts. Figures like Origen, Cyprian of Carthage, and later Augustine referenced the 7 brothers and Eleazar as models of faithfulness under pressure, in some cases explicitly as precedents for Christian martyrs facing Roman persecution. In Jewish tradition, while 2nd Maccabees itself didn't enter the canon, the general memory of the Maccabean period remained culturally significant. The rabbis of the Talmudic period engaged with questions of when it was permissible, or required, to die rather than violate certain commandments, a legal theological discussion directly continuous with the questions Eleazar's story raises. In the medieval Catholic tradition, the Maccabean martyrs were at various points included in liturgical calendars, an unusual category of Old Testament figures receiving what amounted to veneration as saints. And in the modern period, the story has been referenced in context ranging from Holocaust memory, where the Maccabean martyrs were invoked by rabbis trying to make theological sense of catastrophic suffering, to contemporary discussions of civil disobedience and conscientious objection. A story that widely received, across that many different traditions and crises, is doing something more than historical record-keeping. It's carrying a question that human beings apparently cannot stop asking. The question Eleazar's story leaves open. What is that question? I think it's this. When the cost of being honest about who you are becomes very high, what do you do? And underneath that, is there a justice that operates beyond what human systems can deliver? Eleazar answered both questions in the same act. He maintained an honest account of himself at the highest possible cost, in the belief that the justice he trusted extended beyond what any earthly system could either deliver or destroy. Whether you share his theological framework or not, his story presents that posture with remarkable clarity and force. And that's why, more than 2,000 years later, people are still telling it. Closing reflections. If you've made it this far, I want to leave you with something to sit with. Wherever you are in your own experience, whether you're navigating a situation where your integrity is being tested, where a false narrative about you has taken hold, where you feel the pressure to perform something that isn't true about you, the story of Eleazar offers not a formula but a posture, clarity about who you are, awareness of what your choices communicate to others, willingness to let time, and if you're a person of faith, something beyond time, carry the question of ultimate justice. That's not a comfortable answer. It wasn't comfortable for Eleazar either. But according to the text, the tradition that received it, and the 2 millennia of readers who have returned to it, it was the truest answer available. If this kind of historical and theological exploration is meaningful to you, consider subscribing, leaving a comment about which aspect of this story resonated most with you, and sharing this with someone who might need to hear it. There are many more stories like this one, accounts from ancient history that carry questions we're still living inside today. We'll keep digging into them together.